Dear church, let's talk about the Bible and archaeology. Hello, and welcome to the Dear Church podcast. I'm your host, Chris McCurley. My guest today is Dr. Dale Manor from, all the way from Searcy, Arkansas, right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you so much for being a part of the podcast today. I came across Dr. Manor when I was a student at Harding many years ago, and then have crossed paths with you in different speaking engagements and venues, and just love the content of what you bring forth when you talk about how archaeology supports the Bible. And so I'm excited to have you on and kind of give us some details concerning that. Before we jump into that, though, just tell us a little bit about yourself, what's going on in your world.
Well, I taught at Harding for 24 years, and I'm retired now. But given that situation, I'm probably as busy as ever. But prior to that, I preached full-time for 25 years, mostly out in California and Arizona. And then we moved to Searcy, where I began my stint here. My doctorate is in Syro-Palestinian archaeology from the University of Arizona with a minor in Hebrew Bible. Okay. And so my goal was to get into archaeology and try to use it as a tool to enhance our understanding of the biblical world. And in my opinion, it has fulfilled that expectation, perhaps not as greatly as some people would like for it to. Right. But I try to be fair with the evidence. I try to go only as far as the evidence will allow, but at the same time recognize there are still intrinsic difficulties. Now, all that said, one thing that sort of gives me further credibility, let's put that in quotes, is the fact that I am an active field archaeologist. Okay. Yeah. I began my archaeological field work in 1985 at the Philistine site of Ekron, and I was on staff there through 88, and then I went back and excavated at Tel Rakov in the Jordan Valley in 1998 as one of the staff members. And then beginning in 2000, I became the field director of the project at Tel Bet Shemesh, where I continue my investment to this day, even after retirement. Now we're at publishing stage, so we're actually not going too much in the field anymore. We're trying to process the finds and get those published and out to the public. But I'm not just an armchair archaeologist. I get my hands dirty, and it's a wonderful thrill to be the first to look at something and touch something that has been buried for typically 3,000 years is the framework within which I typically work.
Yeah, it's fascinating that to hear you talk about all these things and how you are in the field and some of the discoveries that you have made and that others have made in support of the Bible. Talk a little bit about just in general how archaeology supports the accuracy of Scripture.
Well, excuse me, allergies, it's that season.
I got it.
One, people often ask me about how archaeology proves the Bible. Well, that needs to be nuanced. Mm-hmm. Because there are inevitably things that archaeology will not address merely because of the way things deteriorate and decay. Paper stuff goes away, papyrus, leather rots, and so forth and so on. Food tends to deteriorate, bodies decay, and so forth. Yeah. And then there is the plundering of sites that characterizes human nature either when it's active, people steal things, and especially when it's dormant, people will rob the site of building materials and move them somewhere else. So It's unrealistic to expect archaeology to corroborate everything going on in the text. I'll admit that I sort of got into it with sort of that framework in mind, but I modified my perspective more from the standpoint of moving to how it illustrates and clarifies things that are going on in the biblical text. There are times when I cannot and have not been able to bring the biblical data together with the archaeological data. Now, that said, I'm not one who is of the persuasion that the Bible is therefore suspect. To the contrary, so many times the Bible has been vindicated historically and so forth that I think from the standpoint of sort of jurisprudence, it's best to allow the Bible to stand on its own until one proves it otherwise, which, as I look at it, has not been done anyway.
Right.
But even though I may not be able to bring these data points together, my presupposition, my start point is the Bible is true. And that's sort of the base out of which I operate.
Yeah, talk a little bit about some of the more noteworthy discoveries, maybe on maybe some finds that you have discovered personally, or and also in general that archaeology has uncovered. Talk a little bit about maybe some of the more noteworthy ones.
Oh, that's a huge field. There are a number of things that could be noted. I'm thinking in particular of one. And it's not something anybody really was suspect of, I don't think. But of course, the Bible will narrate that with the death of Solomon, you have Rehoboam acceding the throne, and he goes to Shechem, and he's negotiating with the folks at Shechem to try to get the northern tribes on board with him. And of course, he's sort of idiotic in what he does. And say, I'm going to make everything miserable for you, and increase your taxes and so forth. And so I often refer to it as the North secedes from the Union.
That's a good way to put it.
And so Jeroboam, son of Nevat, they appoint him as king. Now, Jeroboam had been promised by the Lord that if you will follow me and be obedient to me, then I will establish your dynasty forever. But of course, Jeroboam, as sort of typical human being, we have a tendency to trust our own judgment rather than trust the Lord. And so he becomes paranoid, if you will. I doubt they would have used that word in antiquity, but he's suspicious that he's going to lose control of the northern kingdom. And so he sets up different priesthood. He sets up different places of worship. He sets up different gods and it introduces different festivals. And all of these are designed to lure the children of Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel, away from their loyalties to Jerusalem and the temple and the Lord.
Yeah.
And when the excavations at Tel Dan began, and the Bible describes that he sets up at Dan and at Bethel the golden calves. When the excavations began at Tel Dan under the direction of Avraham Baran, they were excavating and they found the high place that Jeroboam built. And I mean, it was a remarkable discovery. Again, I don't think anybody was arguing that it didn't exist. It had never existed, but for him to find it. And there are several permutations of it through time. It sort of morphs as time passes, but there is evidence of the earlier platform associated with the high place. Now that I've talked about that, one of the interesting things, and I'm not sure how well this is going to show up, one of the interesting things was the discovery, not at Dan, I do want to emphasize that. This is a replica. Okay, this is not the real thing. It is full size. This is a replica of a bronze bull that was found in what we would call the area of Manasseh.
Okay.
And whether the golden calf that Jeroboam set up looked like this or not, we can't say. But this discovery is from the time of the Judges, which dovetails perfectly well with what the Judges described. The children of Israel worshiping Baal and Asherah, and the survey in Manasseh region, up in the hills just south of Jezreel Valley, they discovered this site where this bronze bull was weirdly lying on the surface and been uncovered in a rainstorm, and the soil had washed away. Sort of like what a lot of people do when they go out looking for arrowheads in Tennessee and Kentucky and so forth. And so then the excavation was conducted, and it dated to the period of the Judges. And so you had this rather remarkable kind of, wow, here we actually have a bronze bull associated with the people of Israel, which is exactly what the book of Judges and the rest of the Old Testament tends to indicate. And these are some of the kinds of things. It's unnerving how many really, really fascinating discoveries are by accident.
Yeah.
And that one was one that was by accident. They weren't deliberately looking for anything, but somebody had found the bull and reported it to the authorities, and they came and did the investigation and everything else. And I've been working at Tel Bet Shemesh for 24 or 25 years, and we've never found anything quite that grandiose. Now, that doesn't mean it's unimportant, but
Yeah.
and another would be when Israel, and I don't want to get into modern politics here,
Sure.
but in 1967, of course, there was what referred to as the 6-Day War. And the Israelis are attacked by the surrounding Arab countries and thinking they're going to quash the Israelis. And of course, the Israelis are victorious, just stun everybody at how effectively they countered the attack. And they took over what we now refer to as the West Bank and Eastern Jerusalem and so forth. And one of the things that the Israelis feverishly did was to begin excavating as thoroughly as they could, as quickly as they could, because they didn't know when they were going to have to turn all this back over to Arab control. Of course, East Jerusalem still is a hotbed. I mean, all of that's a hotbed of area.
Sure.
But in the excavation, there was the discovery of a huge wall that was sort of in the western part of the old city. And it's referred to in the book of Nehemiah as the Broad Wall.
Okay.
And that's an appropriate name for it because it's like 23 feet thick. I think that's suffices. I mean, that's almost like a double wide mobile home.
Yeah, no kidding.
And, so it turns out that this is part of the defenses that Hezekiah puts in place in order to defend Judah against the onslaught of the Assyrians under the rule of Sennacherib.
Okay.
And this section of the wall is just marvelously preserved up to only a certain height. The superstructure was probably mud brick, but nonetheless, that part's gone, but the foundations and everything are still there. And one of the peculiar things is, as you look at it, if you study it from the standpoint, particularly of as an archaeologist, there is a very clear stratigraphy that occurs. So I'm going to sort of set this up. There's this part of a wall like this. This would be lying flat like that, but I'm trying to sort of show you. You see the walls that are protruding here. And then there's this big wall that lies over it like this. And so you have this big wall superimposed on the ruins of the lower section.
Yeah.
In Isaiah chapter 22, Isaiah talks about them destroying some of the buildings in order to build the fortifications. And that's exactly what we have here. Now, another discovery at the south end of the Temple Mount are the steps that Herod the Great had constructed in order to permit access to the temple area from the south, which would be one of the main avenues of access to it.
Yeah.
And while much of it has been reconstructed, part of the old original steps are still there. And it's rather exhilarating to go there and realize the probability that Jesus walked in this. Now, I can't say for sure. I mean, I don't know through which opening Jesus went into the temple area. I mean, it's sort of a big structure and a big church building. People will often... College Church here in Searcy is huge, and their entrance into the building I've never been through in 25 years.
Right.
So whether Jesus used these southern steps or not, I don't know, but still he would be certainly aware of them. And it's just a lot of things like that are just thrilling.
Yeah.
And it just enriches and brings the biblical narrative to life. When I teach my Bible classes, particularly the historical parts, even a lot of times in the prophets, because the prophets will often intersect with the biblical history, I occasionally will tell the students, what I want you to understand is when I'm telling you this, and even when I was telling you this narrative here, in my head, I'm walking through and looking at all of this stuff.
Yeah.
It's like I'm there. And this is one of the real excitements of going to Israel, whether you're an archaeologist or not,
Right.
and seeing these things. I don't know how many times people have told me, says, I was always sort of reluctant to go to the Holy Land. And then when I went, it was just such an eye-opening experience. And
Yeah.
everything becomes so real in their minds. Well, I've been there 30 some times.
And it never gets old, huh?
Never gets old. Never gets old.
So you have established a museum there at Harding where you have some artifacts, and do you have some of those that you can share with us today? I mean, I know this is not going to be great for those who listen and don't watch the podcast, but for those who are viewing it, and if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, you can come back and watch it on Facebook or YouTube. But I would love for you to talk a little bit about the museum and some of the artifacts that you have on hand.
Okay. The museum, when I moved to Harding, one of the things I wanted to do was to utilize the remains and artifacts that I had found as illustrations. And again, to sort of give an element of this is what the world was like.
Yeah.
It's real. It's not just something on a page in a book. And so I had hoped to have a display case or something and so forth. And getting the traction of all of this with the administration, I better be careful, was difficult. But at one point in 2017, there was a woman from Little Rock named Linda Bird Smith who had been to Israel at least once with Jack Lewis from Harding Graduate School in Memphis. Mm-hmm. And she too had experienced this sort of opening her eyes to the world of the Bible. And in 2017, she donated a lot of money in order to set this museum up.
Yeah.
And so money talks.
For sure.
And so the museum was set up, the room was designed and cabinets built and everything else. And so I really owe this to her. Yeah. And we have about typically 100 artifacts on display in the museum at a time. These change somewhat. And most of them are authentic. Now, there are some replicas. By the way, if you go to essentially any museum in the world, they're going to have replicas.
Right.
And I even noticed recently an announcement of a Tutankhamun display in the Atlanta area. And the golden mask that is on display is a replica.
Yes.
Because they're not letting that out of the country again from Egypt.
Right.
Anyway, so I'll show you a few. Of course, I showed you the replica of the calf.
Yes.
Here is an interesting piece. This is a chalk cup.
Huh.
And it dates, this is authentic, this is real. And it dates to the 1st century BC AD. And what had happened was that the rabbis and the Jews in the 1st century BC AD, reading in the book of Leviticus, I forget which chapter, I think it's chapter 11. Of course, Leviticus, everybody's favorite book.
Yeah, for sure.
And it goes through these discussions of things that are going to be impure and need to be washed and so forth and so on. And it talks about if an unclean animal, such as a chameleon or a lizard or something, or otherwise it becomes unclean, on an artifact, such as a leather artifact or a metal artifact, or wood, those items can be washed. They're unclean till the evening, and then they can be used the next day. However, if the same type procedures fall on a ceramic vessel, pottery, that has to be broken and busted, and hence it's totally taken out of commission. But what's interesting is it doesn't say anything about a stone artifact. And so the rabbis in the 1st century BC AD came to the conclusion, well, then since stone artifacts are not mentioned, then these must be okay. So if they become, I'm assuming they go on the basis that if these become unclean, then we can wash them in sort of the same procedure, and the next day everything's fine. And so you have this slate of construction of these chalk vessels that become characteristic of that time period. Now, they're not exclusive. They don't exclusively use these, but it's this kind of vessel that is referred to in the changing of water to wine, where there are the stone vessels filled with water that are there.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so they're large, and there's a display in the Israel Museum of some of these on display, not from Cana necessarily, but examples of the kind of thing. And so it gives you sort of an understanding. There's sort of large barrels or small barrels, if we think in terms of barrels in our world today. I would say the capacity is, if we think in terms of gallons, it'd be 10 or 11 gallons of water, which is pretty sizable. And so they're sitting there. And so it's chalk vessels like this that escape the kosher problems that take place. Now, interestingly, Mark, in his account of the traditions of the elders, you may avoid the word of God because of traditions, he will talk about the washing of cups and so forth.
Yeah.
And in an explanation to apparently his Gentile world of what's going on. Now, another artifact, sort of in the same household effect. This is not going to look like much of anything, but maybe you can see this fragment that I've glued back together of ceramic piece. It's not very thick, but you see the little dots on it. Can you see? Will this come up clear enough?
Yes, sir.
This dates to about 1000 BC. Okay?
Wow.
It originally would have been about the size of a plow circle, a disc, a plow disc. And those holes on it have a very practical purpose, because when the people in antiquity made their bread, they would often, not necessarily always, but they would often make it sort of like tortilla. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so they'd be thin. They refer to those as pita. Okay. And they would put it on here raw, and the heat would build up in the little indentations and help push the dough back up off of the surface. And so it's sort of a non-stick design.
Ancient Teflon, huh?
Yeah, it's incredible. So we're like 3,000 years ago, they're doing something along that line. Now, another artifact, this one is genuine. By the way, that is genuine. This is a fertility figurine. And these are the kinds of fertility figurines that were very common during the time of Josiah and the end of the divided monarchy.
Okay.
And this is the kind of thing that Josiah is trying to get rid of. Mm-hmm. And hundreds of these things have been found. Typically, they're broken. And they're often apparently broken deliberately, perhaps as a result of Josiah's efforts to initiate that reform. Now, along the same line are sometimes this one looks like a dog, but it isn't. Now, if you look carefully, let me turn it around here. You can see this sort of rough indentation. That's where there's this person sitting on it. So a rider on it. The rider is broken off, and he would be driving the horse. Well, these were often used as worship objects. And again, in Josiah's reforms, you have reference to the horses dedicated to the sun.
Yeah.
And some of these have a little disc on the forehead between the ears representing the sun. That this one does not. But these were objects of the worship of the idolatry characteristic of the Josianic world.
Wow.
Let me see. Okay, I'll stop for a minute. Well, maybe we'll come back to some more.
Yeah,
go ahead.
No, that's just incredible to me, because for someone who starts with the same premise as you do, the Bible is true. It's more fuel to the fire, right? It's just more to affirmation, I guess you would say, to say, this is what I believe. And, I think that it's easy to read scripture and think of it as a different time and place. And while it's true, it's still kind of so out there that I can't really relate to it. As best I try, I still can't. But when you see these kind of artifacts, you're like, yeah, I mean, this was real. This is not make believe. This is not, pretend. This is not some fictional story. This is real life. And, the things that we read about are things that we can touch and feel and they're tangible. It just puts things into a better perspective. It's kind of like when you saw the Passion of the Christ, everything that you had read about, now you have a mental image to go with it, kind of thing. And I'm sure that it's done the same for you. It's only strengthened what you've already believed. And I assume there's a real excitement when you go to the dig site again, every time you go, to say, what can we find this time, perhaps?
Right. As a corollary to that, a lot of people will charge the Bible as being historical fiction.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And, it's sort of like reading some of James Michener's stuff. Okay.
Right.
And Michener did a lot of research when he was writing his book on the source or Texas or whatever. And, but he made up a lot of the narrative. Okay. Understandably, but he put it within the framework of a historical context, but it wasn't history in the sense that we think of history.
Yeah.
Well, one of the peculiarities, take Jeremiah, for instance. Jeremiah, in the book of Jeremiah, there are references to quite a number of individuals who only appear once or twice in the narrative, and that's the end of it. Okay.
Yeah.
And one of these guys is Ukal, and I think it's son of Shelemiah. I forget who his dad is, but anyway. And then there's another individual who is referred to as well. I'm sorry, I'm not remembering right off the top of my head.
No, that's fine.
These individuals. But, they only appear like once or twice in the narrative. They are people who are opposed to Jeremiah's work and want to imprison him.
Mm-hmm.
Archaeologists have found little inscriptions with these guys' names and the names of their parents on them.
Wow.
From the time period of Jeremiah. And, if someone were simply writing this as historical fiction, especially at a later date, why in the world would you have this kind of little detail that is now confirmed archaeologically?
Exactly.
I mean, it just, on a certain level, doesn't make a lot of sense. And to a large extent, it wouldn't be really critically important to the flow of the narrative, if you're just making up fiction, to just have somebody else's name stuck in there. Right. But these are real people.
Yes. Yeah, they really existed. And I think it's worth noting, because you said this in the beginning, that, sometimes, not you, but some want to make it work so badly that they'll connect dots that ain't there or something like that. And you see that, I'm sure you're big on TikTok, but if you look at TikTok and social media, you see, you see that they found the ark, and here is the ark, and they've got, or you see the chariot wheels at the bottom of the ocean and stuff like that. And obviously we want those things to be true. We want to find, we want things to work out like that. But I think what you said in the beginning is something that we need to really pay attention to, is that don't connect dots that aren't there, right?
Right. And the other part is don't erase dots.
Sure. Absolutely. Absolutely. Which does it, I guess that happens too. Does some try to explain away some of the things that y'all have found?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So let me, I don't know if this is going to show up. I have, in our excavation at Tel Bet Shemesh, of course, we have a goal that we're trying to accomplish. And the goal, the overarching goal, is to look at, Bet Shemesh is in a border area relative to where Israel first arrives. And so you have Israel in the central hills and the Philistines arriving on the coastal plain. And of course, the Canaanites are resident throughout the region. And so one of the tasks that we have at Bet Shemesh is to look at the social cultural interaction of these three cultures as they do a give and take and an ebb and flow of political control in all of this. And there's actually a specific reference in 1 Samuel when the ark is returning to Israel from Philistine custody after that disastrous battle. And it talks about the Philistines following the cows and the cart to the border of Bet Shemesh. Now, we don't know exactly, I don't think it's sort of a checkpoint in the sense that we think of borders.
Right.
They understood in the ancient world politically, we're in control here, they're in control there, and this is sort of the relatively line of demarcation. So that's sort of the overarching task that we have. But inevitably, one of the things that happens in essentially any excavation is you're digging down, and you find stuff that you'd never expect to find.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that we ran into was a palace dating to about 1350 BC. And we have evidence, which I don't have time to get into here. We have evidence to connect this palace with a woman who corresponded with Amenhotep III in Egypt. And her name is Ninur-Mahmesh. And she's corresponding with Amenhotep to apprise him of the threat of a group of marauding type people, at least that's how she perceives them, who are creating havoc in the land of Canaan, who are referred to as the Apiru. And twice she sends to the king in Egypt to warn him of the threat of these people.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that they were responsible for the destruction of a number of sites sprinkled around the land of Canaan.
Right.
One of which becomes Tel Bet Shemesh.
Huh. Okay.
They destroyed Tel Bet Shemesh in an intense fire. And so we dig down, and we come to the surface of all of these tumbled mud bricks that have, mind you, these are mud bricks. Being dried mud bricks, then they're just dried mud. But these have been fired into brick because of intense conflagration. And they're tumbled all down here to everything else. And one of the weird things about archaeology is we tend so often, it's horrible how often this happens, we find the really nifty stuff the last week of the dig.
Right when you have to leave. Huh?
Right when we have to leave. And then we do it now. And so we have to scramble around in order to preserve it for the next season, and then we can renew our project the next season. Well, that's exactly what we did. We came down and all these tumbled mud bricks here. And we just got ecstatic because, and this is going to sound really sadistic and twisted. Anybody knows me that, okay.
That's perfectly fine.
we were excited because we were looking forward to seeing the destruction below the tumble of brick. Because when people voluntarily leave, they'll gather up their stuff and they take it with them. But if it's a siege situation where the building either catches on fire or whatever, or warfare, and everything collapses, then pretty much a lot of the material that is in those buildings is still there.
Right.
Oftentimes broken, but nonetheless, it's still there. Sure. And so we had to wait a whole year back there and excavate this. And it was productive to our wildest imagination.
Really?
And at the time, we didn't make any connection with Ninur-Mahmesh or Amenhotep. But one of the things that happened is, okay, this is a mud brick from the site. Okay. Now, what I want you to see here, this doesn't show up real well, but you see these little grooves?
Yes.
Those are what we refer to as mason marks.
Okay.
Now, let me hold this back. This you can see the grooves a little bit still. This is just a fragment of the brick. Okay. And when we found this, it was like, wow, mud brick. Children of Israel were in the land of Egypt.
Yes.
Mud bricks. And if you read the narrative, admittedly, that was in Egypt. This is in Bet Shemesh. But in Egypt, they were required to maintain the same quota of bricks per day.
Yes.
And we think, almost certain, that this mark on the brick was the mason who made the brick making his mark on it so that when he has come up with appropriate number of bricks for the day, he can go home.
Ah, yeah. Makes sense.
And I have a picture of me dragging my fingers across the mud brick because, here was a classic situation of, I don't know who this guy was or woman. It's sort of like reaching across 1,300 or 3,300 years and shaking hands with this person who made this.
Yeah, you're touching the same brick.
touching the same brick and, following the path. Now, I know that everything that was made in antiquity was made by someone, okay?
Yeah, for sure.
But this was so personalized. And it was just exhilarating.
Yeah.
And nothing to do with the Bible. It's just one of those,
Yeah.
this is a real world in which we're living.
Yeah. Yeah, that is fascinating. I mean, that's the only way you can describe it, is just to be able to touch and hold something that is that old and that somebody else touched and held so long ago. That's a connection like nothing else, right?
Right.
Yeah. Hey, thank you so much, Dr. Manner, for joining us today. This has been so enlightening, so interesting, and I know that our podcast guests who are tuning in are going to love this episode. And I want to let them know that if they have a question about today's episode, they can email me at chris.mccurley@rippleoflight.com. If you have a specific question for Dr. Manner, we'll make sure that we forward it on to him, and I'm sure he'd be willing to answer any questions that you might have. But I just want to thank everyone for tuning in. I just want to thank you so much, Dr. Manner, for being on today.
My pleasure, and thank you, and wish you the best in your work.
Absolutely, and you too, and thank everyone. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. Sincerely, Chris.